A very pleasant good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. And in our native language, magandang umaga po, magandang tanghali, magandang hapon, at magandang gabi. This is Rita Gadi. Welcome to your hour. Today we are going back in time and then going forward to the present. And that is why our program title is Revisiting, Reviewing, and Restoring. February 7, that's 2 days ago, former Secretary of State of the United States of America, George P. Shultz, died at 100 years old. 35 years ago, also on a February 7, our country, had the snap elections. They say there are no coincidences. And perhaps we go back to the Greek times of the Pythagorean theory, his master mathematician. We don't exactly know how numbers figure out in the timeline or coincidences, or it just happens that on February 7th, which changed the life and the course of our country, so too with the life and the course of Ferdinand Marcos, Imelda Romualdez Marcos and their family, and so too just 2 days ago, on a February 7th, it was the end of the life of George P. Shultz. Why am I relating this? That is revisiting a day 35 years ago when President Marcos declared sometime back, November of 1985, that there would be elections here in our country. Not the regular kind of elections, but the snap elections. That's why they call it snap. In other words, under our Constitution and under the Commission on Elections law, elections should have been 1987. But what happened was there was this maneuvering, so to speak, that was undertaken by the State Department, which was leading the way towards the snap elections, and that was what happened. Why am I saying that it was leading the way? Well, we have the book of former Secretary of State George Shultz. He had several chapters in that book that he wrote. Usually they do this. Presidents, former cabinet members of America, etc. They compile the life of their service and they write a book. Well, George Shultz was a very known personality at the time because it was not just the Philippines that he was handling as Secretary of State, he was handling the whole world. That is how important the office of the Secretary of State is. Now that we have a change of administration in the United States of America, there is a new Secretary of State, a certain Secretary Blinken. So we have to really be very aware of how important that office is. It practically lays out the foreign policy. That is the department that deals with other countries of the world. They go into wars, invasions, changes of government, etc. But the primary concern would be what is the interest of the United States of America. So, as I've said, on a February 7th, 2 days ago, George Shultz, the Secretary of State, died. 35 years ago, also on the February 7th, we had the snap elections. Now, what is this that I am trying to relate? Let's go back in time to about several months prior to that February 1986. And this happened sometime October, November, but it was finalized in November 3rd to be exact. Mrs. Marcos has just come from the Soviet Union. She went there with a delegation of priests to enshrine the images of Our Lady of Peace and Our Lady of Fatima in the church St. Louis Cathedral in the heart of Moscow. She was there to complete the journey on the month of Our Lady, which is the month of October. a visionary informed her that it was the Blessed Virgin herself who requested in a dream that the images of the Blessed Virgin should be enshrined and consecrated in the Soviet Union, which was at the time and still is a communist country. So that was the delegation that Mrs. Marcos brought after passing by Rome to have the images blessed by the Holy Father himself, who is now Saint Paul, and those are the images that were consecrated there at the Saint Louis Cathedral in Moscow. And so on the way home after the consecration, she stopped over in Tokyo for an important meeting, and that was about November, the first days of November. In fact, the exact date was November 3rd. And that was when Marcos, who remained in the Philippines, announced on television with the show of David Brinkley. That was yes, David Brinkley's show, and that was when he said, well, we might as well settle this and have us, I'll call for the snap elections. Then he announced that the snap elections would be January 17, 1986. But what happened was this was reprogrammed. In other words, it was not January 17. Why? Because again, as I've said, some movement in the State Department were not yet ready for the snap elections. They did not know at the time, by November, who they were going to place as a candidate um, in the opposition against Marcos. And they had to prepare for this because, prior to that, there were a lot of emissaries that were already telling Marcos that you should resign, you should step down, etc., and all of this. And that's exactly why President Marcos decided, let the people decide, not you from the State Department, not you from Washington, who will tell me what to do as far as running our government is concerned. Let the people decide. I'll put myself into a vote, and that was it. So instead of January 17, it was postponed to February 7, 1986. So there will be that 60-day period during which whoever will be the opposing candidate against Marcos would be able to have a period of campaign. As far as the President Marcos is concerned, he was the incumbent. So all he had to do, in a way, was to announce that he was running for re-election in the snap elections, and perhaps he would be visiting some major cities just to deliver his program for the snap elections and why it was necessary to call the snap election. So that was how it was. But I am putting this into that perspective of revisiting February 7, because prior to that, as I've said, there were a lot of movements happening in the State Department, which was undertaken by the Secretary of State, George Shultz, who died 2 days ago, February 7, 2021. Now, what were these maneuverings? If we really go back in time, prior to the office of George Shultz, his occupying the office of Secretary of State, if we go back in time to the first year of President Marcos, in fact, as president, 1966, if we go back to that particular period, and then we had also contemporaneous to that to the time that he was installed as president, elected as president, we had the Vietnam War, which was raging approximately 5-6 hours away from us, actually. And the Vietnam War, as we've always described it, was a surrogate war between the Soviet Union, which was called at the time the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, or for short, it was called the Soviet Union. Today, we call it the Russian Federation. But at the time, it was the Soviet Union supporting the communist forces versus the South Vietnamese that were supported by the United States of America. So it was a surrogate war of these two world powers at that time. China was still a quiet dragon, so to speak. It was not yet involved in any of these discussions or any of these conflicts, but it was really the Soviet Union and the United States of America. As a matter of fact, many of us during that period, and perhaps many of you would still remember, most of these Hollywood movies and documentaries and all of this propaganda was really about the espionage between the Soviet Union and the United States of America, the CIA versus the KGB, etc., and all of this. And that was the period that they called the Cold War. A Cold War meaning it was not a direct confrontation of the governments themselves, but as I've said, surrogate wars. They were supporting countries that were in conflict because one part of that country had was inclined for the communist ideology, a political system of the communists, and the other was for democracy, and that was how it was. So what was happening then was the Philippines, with Marcos as the newly installed president, was expected to join the United States of America in the Vietnam War because we were the bastion of democracy, a former colony of the United States of America for 45 years, as a matter of fact. So it was expected that we would lead the alliance of other countries in our region that are democratically inclined to join the United States of America and join and participate in the Vietnam War versus the Soviet Union. So, with that in mind, the State Department and all its media propaganda decided to play up the President Marcos. He was the decorated war hero. He was the bar top notcher. He was one of the outstanding politicians in our country, and also that he was he won the presidency after quite like a landslide, so to speak. So he was played up as the ideal leader of the free world in in our particular region. And immediately after he was installed, he was invited already for a state visit to Washington, to the United States of America. And there, expectedly, he would announce that as the President of the Republic of the Philippines, a staunch supporter of the United States of America, an ally, a partner, etc., whatever else there is between our relationship with Washington, he would announce that he would be leading the support to the United States of America for the war that was waging in Vietnam. But what happened was he did not. He did not announce any support at all for joining the United States of America in the war in Vietnam. Instead, his speech before the joint houses of Congress, and as you've said, it was extemporaneous but quite long, he spoke of the Second World War, where the bond of blood, actually blood brothers, if you would call this, between the United States of America soldiers and the militiamen and the Filipinos joined together in defense of democracy in our country, fighting the Japanese. And of course, that was the war where they said in all their propaganda that Marcos was the most decorated hero at the time, and that he elaborated on the fact that that began the closeness or the bond of between the United States of America and the Philippines, and also that after all those years, because that was already 1966, and the war ended in 1944. We had the liberation of the Philippines in 1945 and our independence of the United States of America there with after the Second World War. So you can imagine that that was the tone of President Marcos' speech before the joint houses of Congress. And he also said that it is about time that Congress, the United States Congress, would remember that the Filipino soldiers fought as part of the American forces. In fact, they were under what is known as the United States Armed Forces for the Far East, or the acronym of USAFE. And we had young Filipino soldiers, 17, 18, and really very young at the time, who joined the American forces here in defense of our country to fight the Japanese. So that was when President Marcos told the American Congress it is about time that you pay now the veterans due, the due that are the payment, the benefits and the payment that is due the veterans of that World War, because you promised this and the Filipino soldiers fought under your flag. The war was not against us and Japan. The war was against the United States of America and Japan. But it so happened that two of the largest American military bases were here in our country. That was why we were invaded by the Japanese. You had Clark Air Force Base and you had the Subic Naval Base. And so that was the reason why we got involved in that particular war, the Pacific War, as a matter of fact. That's why that was the Second World War. So since Marcos did not pronounce categorically that he would be joining the United States of America in the Vietnam War. That, of course, hurt Washington. I am going back to that time so that you will realize that America does not forget. In other words, there could be changes of administration. You could have other presidents that came after. At the time, it was Lyndon Johnson. There were other presidents after Johnson and several others. But the State Department, since I've said, is the one that actually handles the policy and foreign policy of America, it does not forget. The bureaucracy is the one that really goes grinding regarding all of this pronouncements being made by other countries. So that was one, well, if you could say, one thorn in the relationship between Marcos himself and the State Department, or Washington for that matter. But nonetheless, they could not remove Marcos at the time. He was very popular in the first term and in his second term likewise, precisely because there were a lot of development programs that he instituted for the country itself. And we must remember, their interest is not really the people who are sitting there in the office of the president, but the American bases. They had to make sure that the American bases were safe from any amendments, revisions, because we had the Mutual Defense Treaty with the United States of America regarding those bases. So that was their primary concern, especially since, as I've said, the Vietnam War was raging. And of course, there was still the Soviet Union. And you must remember, we are so strategically located that if you have to get into the Asia mainland, you had to pass through us, not unless they want to get into the Soviet Union through the Aleutian Channel in Alaska. They could cross as I've said, the Aleutian Islands and enter into Vladivostok, one of the ports of Russia there, or from that part, but that would be, well, not only precarious for them, but it would be very difficult, precisely not only because of the weather. Vladivostok is frozen, 8 months every year, and annually. So they really had to pass through Philippine waters to get into the Asia mainland where, well, at the time, the Soviet Union was located, the People's Republic of China, and of course, the rest of the ASEAN countries, which in 1965, 66, we were called the SEATO, the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, the way the NATO was also formed as a national alliance there in Europe. So that was how it was. So what were their interests here? As a former colony of the United States, their bases. They had to be sure that the bases are intact. It is unhampered by any kibitzers of politicians or whatever. And that was their main interest, precisely because, as I've said, there was the Vietnam War raging, and there was still the threat of the Soviet Union entering into whatever it is that America would want to put a check into. So anyway, that was how it was. But what did Marcos do? In spite of the fact that he already refused to join the American troops in Vietnam, he said, I will be sending my soldiers, but they will be involved in what? In construction, in medical services, in infrastructure, or some kind of at least a token of support in that manner. But they're not going to carry guns, and they're not going to fight in that war. But they will be there to show America that we are the brother Philippines, the brown brother, so to speak, and that we are in alliance with the fight to have a democracy in Vietnam and to have North and South Vietnam united under a democratic regime, which did not happen after several years of this war that was raging. But after this incident, you could see the action being undertaken by Washington against Marcos. Perhaps those of us who lived through that period do not realize how several economic measures and several trade relations were actually part of the displeasure that Washington was showing Marcos. For instance, it was the sugar. They did not, our sugar was exported, a big export that was to the United States of America. And then suddenly, you will recall this incident, and it coincided with the fact that that was the time that Mrs. Marcos was in the United Nations for the first time, invited to address the General Assembly, when our ships, which were supposed to unload already the sugar, were refused. America did not want to accept the sugar. They decided that it was harmful for the health, and just suddenly, Why did they not do this prior to the ships, parking there in their ports? But they did this really to hurt us. And you can imagine, what do you do with the sugar there and the demurrage of those big ships that were carrying this cargo, which could not be unloaded. So you had to pay for the parking fee. And you know this, as far as maritime law is concerned, you had to pay the demurrage. And so Mrs. Marcos had to go from one ambassador to another at the General Assembly and asked, "Would you like to buy our sugar? It's right here." So that was it. Parang nagbebenta ka ng, just so long as so that we would be able to dispose of it, and that the demurrage would not be increasing on a day-to-day basis. How difficult it was. So you could see slowly they were trying to make it uneasy and uncomfortable and very expensive financially for us. That was already part of the way their policy was weaving into trying to pressure Marcos to do what they would want him to do. And they do this. You have seen this over the past several decades with other countries likewise, but they could not do it so um, violently in a way, because they needed Marcos for the protection of their bases, and they needed the stability of the country precisely because of the two American bases here. And that was when, from New York, Mrs. Marcos went to Cuba, Fidel Castro, which is a communist country, and she was supposed to propose to Fidel Castro, what can we do, countries like us, which are the sugar producing countries, what can we do so that we can protect our products against the refusal of the United States of America to buy from us? Suddenly, they will just cut off the export that we have traditionally done with them. So that was the reason why she went to Cuba, to find out what could be done, and would be also involving other countries, other sugar producing countries. So we could have some kind of a unification of exports to countries which would be accepting our sugar, so that we are not dependent on the whim and the caprice of the United States of America. As I've said, these are part of the foreign policies coming from the State Department, their Trade Department, which is being expressed by the State Department. Trade and economic and financial and investment relationship, it's all tied up to what the foreign policy actually is. But other than that, what was observed in Cuba was the Guantanamo base. And that was where we learned in Cuba, Mrs. Marcos learned that Guantanamo is an American territory and an American property, because according to Fidel Castro himself, telling Imelda that 30 years of occupancy, of possession, becomes ownership. And that's what happened. They were not able to drive the Americans away from the Guantanamo base, the military base of the Americans there. So now you have, to this day, Guantanamo as an American territory. And so that brought the idea to President Marcos that, how many years na ba yung bases dito sa Philippines? Maybe one day we just wake up and these two military bases here of the Americans will become their possession, and we can't get them back anymore if there is such an international law. So Marcos asked for a review of the Mutual Defense Treaty, which should have been a treaty with the American bases installed here for 99 years, almost 100. So what he did was to bring it down to just 25. And so if you count the time from the time that they actually had the bases under them, under their supervision, management, and administration, then he cut it down now to just 25 years, which would have ended in 1992. So that was just pretty close already, not within his term, but pretty close already to the time that he asked for the review of the Military Defense Treaty. Plus the fact that, other than cutting down from 99 years to 25 years, he also said that the Military Defense Treaty should be reviewed every 5 years by every change of administration that we had here in our country, so that the new president, after after the term of the old president, would have the opportunity and the chance to review the bases himself. It's not anything that is there, indelibly marked forever. So the presidents will have a chance to review it. And of course, again, as you said, that was at the displeasure of Washington. So you see, these are events that were adding up, and it is being logged in, not only in the memory bank of the foreign policy of the United States or Washington or of the State Department, but this is compiling as to how leaders outside of America are behaving and are not behaving according to how they should want these leaders to behave. And of course, they did not like the fact that Marcos asked for a review of the military defense treaty, or the fact that it is now cut down to 25 years, or the fact that it is now to be reviewed every 5 years. They did not like this, but they're logging it as part of their memory, because one day they will they will get back at, either at Marcos or at the Philippines regarding such actuations as far as our dealings with the United States of America is concerned. Now, in addition to that, sometime in the 70s also, the president decided on his own, without getting clearance from the bastion of the democratic way of life, of democracy. He launched the foreign policy to befriend the Middle Eastern countries first, and then the Soviet Union. So we opened diplomatic relations first with the communist country in Moscow, with the opening of our foreign relations then at the time. And that was something, of course, which perhaps not only shocked, but caught Washington flat-footed in a way, because that was not by their advice or with their approval. It was Marcos' foreign policy that, with the Soviet Union being within our region here in Asia, and there is no reason why we cannot befriend the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics at the time. That was the opening of our diplomatic relations then in 1974. The following year, that was not enough. The following year, President Marcos also opened diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China, another communist country. So these are two big powers within our region, where our country opened diplomatic relations with, against the political and ideological thinking of the United States of America. So, as I've said, nakalista yan. It's listed down in their memory book of, wow, what is this Marcos trying to do? So you could see how important it is that we go back in time to those incidents, because you will be asking, why did the State Department under George Shultz decide to suddenly get Marcos out of our country, to remove Marcos from power? Well, it's not just that thing that happened then, or that the thinking that they had at the time, but as I've said, it is a compilation, the summary of all the different actions taken by President Marcos. And then, of course, there were three items that George Shultz said that made him consider to have Marcos removed from power. He was thinking of the communist insurgency. Then he was also considering the fact that the cronies of Marcos, so to speak, are now the ones handling several major industries, and the other cronies of the previous administration had no chance to get into the limelight as far as investments, etc., concerned. But beyond that, it was also because they wanted the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank to really squeeze Marcos in such a way that whatever loans they would be giving to our country would be in accordance to the kind of investments that they would want to happen. And one of those that was really rather ticklish already at the time was our entrance into the World Trade Organization, which Marcos refused all throughout his last years in office, because he was afraid that if we enter into the World Trade Organization, all the other countries can now just come in and bring in their own products, and we cannot even compete with these products, because we are still in that stage of developing our industries and developing our agriculture. Sure, he did not want to enter into the WTO because it would harm the development process that was already in place. In fact, what he did was he started a massive irrigation. Agriculture was given really an impetus. Remember that I've already mentioned this in several of our episodes. We were already exporting rice, And so that would be leading on to several other agricultural products. And so we will not be dependent on the dictates of the IMF and the World Bank regarding how we are going to industrialize. And so that is the reason why he did not want to enter into the WTO, because that would really harm many of our movements towards being self-sufficient in products, etc. We can't compete with other countries that would be sending in all of their developed products already. So that was another factor that, of course, did not sit very well as far as the State Department is concerned. And then, of course, the bases. They were afraid that somewhere along the line, Marcos would do something again or announce something again with the Mutual Defense Treaty. And that was very crucial to them, because already at that stage, with our befriending the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China, baka meron gawing si Marcos na pwede na rin sila magtayo ng bases nila dito. Why not? Because they were wary of this. So you could see that again, the American interest in the bases was there, and it was crucial. And they were not sure again how the thinking of Marcos would proceed over the years, because as I've said, when we entered into the diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China, this was not with the go signal of Washington itself. So they were afraid of that. They were wary of this. And since they did not know how to read Marcos's mind, they were worried about this. And then, of course, the other item which they were afraid was they knew about the illness of President Marcos, that he had a kidney transplant, that he was he had several other episodes where perhaps his health was already in such a stage that it could be, it was dangerous. It was a precarious state of health that he had. This was known, of course, from the other American doctors that assisted in the surgery of President Marcos. So they were afraid that he could go anytime, and that the question of succession, who would come after Marcos, that was the greatest fear that they had. And that is why, as I've said, the State Department was already thinking that there should be the kind of transition or that kind of election where there would be a vice president that could take over in case anything happens to President Marcos. Plus, also, that they feared that Imelda might take over, that Mrs. Marcos might take over. What was their fear of Mrs. Marcos? Simple. I already mentioned the opening of diplomatic relations. You will recall it was Mrs. Marcos that was sent ahead by President Marcos to these countries before Marcos opened diplomatic relations and before he made the state visit. So there was the effectivity of Mrs. Marcos entering into a communist country with a completely different political system and ideology, and being able to befriend the leadership of that country and to be given an award as a comrade of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic, which is rarely given to foreigners. In fact, it's given to their astronauts or not even to their heroes in war, because everybody for them is a hero when you go to war to defend Russia. But it was given to Mrs. Marcos as a comrade, and that was something which, of course, the State Department could not, they could not even talk about it. In fact, media did not even have a good write-up regarding this, but that was a very crucial kind of an award, and that was Imelda. And then, of course, entering the People's Republic of China, my goodness, everything they knew about China was just the Cultural Revolution, how hundreds and thousands of Chinese are being killed and eliminated, because that's exactly what the Cultural Revolution is all about. You have Chairman Mao Zedong. Imagine walking the 1,000-mile from his Yunnan caves all the way up to Beijing to declare the unification of China. Those little kingdoms, actually. China has always been invaded by other countries. Never was it able to unite as one whole nation to be able to preserve itself against the world. And so you had Chairman Mao Zedong, and then, of course, succeeded by Deng Xiaoping, who entered into the era of capitalism and communism combined. And then, of course, Zhou Enlai, one of the most brilliant and exceptionally fine minds that the People's Republic of China ever had. And that, of course, disturbed Washington. So you can imagine who began all of this, entering these countries and being able to befriend them before our own president would open diplomatic relations. That was Imelda Romualdez Marcos. And the reception was outstanding, as I've said, amazingly outstanding. when the plane of Mrs. Marcos landed in Beijing, you could see as far as your eye can see all the children waving flowers and flags, welcoming her. Never has there ever been such a reception in any other country that she has been. Neither has China ever welcomed any guest in such a manner. So nakakagulat. Of course, the State Department is surprised. Ano ito? It's only Imelda. It's not even a head of state. That was the fear they had. The quality that Mrs. Marcos had to enter into the chambers of the most powerful leaders of the world and befriend them personally as a personal friend. But then, of course, the biggest medal of it all was her entrance into Libya. Can you imagine? She was able to get Gaddafi to sign the Tripoli Agreement, which granted autonomous regions to 10 provinces and 5 cities in southern Philippines, actually ending the MILF-MNLF war and presenting the autonomous region for both the Christians, the Muslims together. That was really an exceptional kind of an agreement that she brokered, that she was able to establish in spite of the fact that Fidel Ramos and Secretary Enrile left her in Tripoli, because they felt that Gaddafi was not willing to negotiate with the Philippine government, but she was able to penetrate that particular enclave, and particularly to be able to inform him that there was no genocide that was happening here, and to think that Nur Miswari was already broadcasting genocide at the Islamic Conference, which is, as a matter of fact, an American creation. So why am I putting all of this together? Because there were so many instances which perhaps were not given enough importance as they were happening, and has been forgotten in time. That is why we are revisiting, and we are reviewing, and we are restoring those memories, because they form the part of what is so important in our lives today. So here was the fear that the State Department had during the time of George Shultz, that Imelda might succeed Marcos. And my goodness, it was not, they tried to present her as frivolous, as ostentatious, but I am telling you, we have to revisit what exactly she has done for their country in our foreign policy, because that is where the State Department of America is so sensitive about. They were not able to do this. None of their diplomats, none of their ambassadors were able to do this. And you had an Imelda that was able to do this. And so that is the fear they had. If she takes over, kaya niya. Anything else, not with the sophisticated diplomacy or the diplomatic language and all of this, highfalutin manner by which such negotiations are conducted, but really common sense, which she really has a great storage of. She grew up in a small town in Tacloban in Leyte, as she could describes it, a third-class town in a fourth-class municipality. But that was the common sense she learned precisely. Can you imagine, as soon as she became First Lady, to think of culture and art as the sanctuary of the Filipino soul, and to bring this to the world and to say, this is how beautiful we are. Where is this coming from? So you could see her thinking is so different from the Western kind of thinking, where you had to assert power and you had to assert, by force, and that this is how big we are and how great we are. No, she did it with charm. She did it in art. She did it with culture. And what is culture? Culture is simply the enhancement of our nature. And that is exactly what she utilized. Wearing the Filipina dress, the terno, to show to the world, this is how beautiful we are. Hindi naintindihan ng Amerika yan. They cannot comprehend it. How would they destroy her? How do they fear her? Precisely because of those little nuances of her common sense and her cultural ability and her creativity to befriend all of this work. Can you imagine Mao Zedong kissing the back of her palm, the back of the palm of her hand, photographed throughout the world? My goodness, have you ever seen from that time any head of state or any leader or any queen or any lady who has gone to the People's Republic of China, and you had Mao Zedong, the chairman of the Cultural Revolution, bowing down to kiss the back of her hand, the palm of her hand? So these are perhaps things which we have to revisit, because these items, these powerful gestures, were not given enough emphasis at the time. But that is the secret why George Shultz was so afraid that in case anything happens to Marcos, the successor would be Imelda. Because at the back of their minds, they perhaps do not understand this completely. How was she able to get into Mao Zedong, Chou Enlai, and Deng Xiaoping? How? Dangerous, because sabi ko nga, none of their brilliance and none of their power was able to do anything like it. And if she would succeed Marcos, she was even the opening line of Marcos to all of these great leaders. And if she would be sitting there by herself as the successor to Marcos, that's dangerous for the State Department. That was George Shultz. Of course, he did not write about it. He did not talk about it, but they had the entire PR and media that was destroying Imelda and Marcos. Marcos was a dictator and Imelda was ostentatious and frivolous. That is as far as they could go. That was 35 years ago, or perhaps even 54 years ago if we go back to 1966, when Imelda and Ferdinand Marcos were in Malacanang. So you can imagine how important it is now to revisit. As I said, February 7 is the day that George Shultz died, and he was the prime mover for the removal of President Marcos. I will not go over all the details, but I will just present to you here. This is the book of George Shultz, Turmoil and Triumph. This is his book. It is comprised of many chapters. All the other countries he has touched, all the people he has met with, there is a short chapter there. Maigsi lang, actually, compared to the other chapters. People Power ang title. And that is where he described exactly where he got in to maneuver the removal of Marcos. As he said himself, as he was bragging about it in his book, it was not a matter of how, because they already knew how to remove him. It was a matter of when. So what was the how? How to remove Marcos? So that was the snap elections. That was the beginning. And they had to delay it from January 17, as I've said, to February 7. February 7 was the day of the snap elections. Why? Why did they have to do this? Because by the November, late November, when Marcos announced for the snap elections, and by December, they were already dramatizing the fact that Marcos was going to cheat. He was going to cheat in the elections. Hindi pa nga nagkakaroon ng eleksyon. February 7 pa. But they had to prepare the media. There are several articles in this. You should read about it, how the media did Marcos in. Several of those. And then, of course, in the book of George Shultz itself, that became the preparation of when to remove Marcos. So first they had to dramatize that Marcos was going to cheat. So tuloy-tuloy yan, magdadaya. He was going to cheat. And they supported the NAMFREL, and they built it up that the NAMFREL is the holy choice of God, and that they were saintly, etc. They were saintly people and so forth. And it was Marcos as the bad one, and Marcos would cheat. So they pitted the NAMFREL versus the Commission on Elections and the COMELEC, which is the government institution. So they had to do this continuously. And there were several meetings regarding this. I just wrote down several names. You will remember these names, of course. You had Armacost, who was formerly our ambassador, the American ambassador to the Philippines. Armacost, they were always meeting with what they call this. Yeah, he was always meeting with the RAM. In fact, prior to the RAM being with Enrile when they decided to break away from Marcos, Armacos was early on already meeting with them. And then you had several meetings also with Fidel Ramos. And then you had, let me look at these names. You had Armacos, you had, who were the others here? Point Dexter, Weinberger, Stephen Sollarts, one of the congressmen. He was the one who stood in Congress and lambasted Marcos, saying that Marcos stole the money of the Filipino people. That's where it all began. He stole the money of the Filipino people, and he also stole the money of the Americans. Remember, he was bragging about this in Congress in the privileged speech, and said that the U.S. aid that was being given to the Philippines, the military assistance that is being to the Philippines, was being stolen by Marcos, and he went 1 hour and 50 minutes, close to 2 hours of a privileged speech in the American Congress lambasting Marcos. That was also at about the same timing, at about the time, January and February, at the time that the campaign was ongoing for the snap elections. Kaya lahat yan, may timing. Merong dahilan kung bakit nilalabas lahat yan at the time, just to destroy the image of Marcos to the Filipino people and to the world. And that was how they had to prepare. They had to prepare the exit of Marcos, and that was all undertaken by the Secretary of State, George Shultz. It is in his book. You could read it there. They were meeting also with several of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, sila Poindexter and so forth. And then there was the this is something which was never written about. You had what's his name now? The editor of the editor of the New York Times. I'm sorry, was it the Washington Post? Well, anyway, he came back to the Philippines from the Philippines, and he said, why did you choose Cory Aquino to fight against Marcos? Marcos is an outstanding man, and this lady has there's nothing much that you could say about her. And you cannot insult Marcos, but he's a great leader and a friend of America. And then of course you had another person that came from here, from the Philippines, and when he was meeting with several of the people in the State Department, they were also saying that Cory Aquino is blank. She's a blank. I'm quoting that from the book of George Shultz. But anyway, they did everything to create the perception. That's exactly where that phrase comes from. Perception is reality. And that's exactly what George Shultz said. We have to create the perception that Marcos is going to cheat, and that if he wins, he cheated. So that was already the scenario, so that he could ignite the people to go against Marcos because he cheated his way to the presidency, and that was it. Then, since all of this was not happening, because they could see there was also half the country, or even more than half, that was really routing for Marcos, and then the elections on February 7 happened, and Marcos was declared the winner in that election. By February 16, Cory announced in a press conference that she got elected. So you could see now that conflict. And then you had the United States of America supporting her and saying that she was cheated. I mean, Marcos cheated her, and that is what was happening. So the rest is history. You all know already what happened thereafter, and that is why, as I've said, we are revisiting those days in February. We are actually reviewing what has happened, and in consonance with this book of George Shultz, Triumph and Turmoil, and of course restoring what the facts are, the truth that happened during those times. So that was when they sent Ambassador Philip Habib, and that was where I already mentioned how Philip Habib met with President Marcos and laid down several demands from the State Department. Remember, all these ambassadors are under George Shultz. Former, prior, present. Bosworth, Armacos, lahat ng mga yan. And then you had Philip Habib, he was formerly ambassador to Israel and several other in Turkey and all of that. So he was a former ambassador, and he was the one sent by President Marcos, to President Marcos, to have President Marcos declare that, number one, that he was willing to have some kind of a conciliation or a partnership with Cory Aquino should it happen that Cory Aquino is also taking her oath of office and Marcos took his oath of office, and so magkaroon sila ng parang reconciliation. I don't know how they called it, pero parang Council of Elders or whatever. Marcos said, no, you cannot tell me how to run my country better than I can. That's exactly how Marcos answered. And then, of course, they wanted Imelda removed from all her offices. They wanted General Ver removed also, although Marcos already had the appointment of General Ramos, which was supposed to have taken place in March, pero nauna na yung February. So that was also one of the demands, and they wanted all the cabinet members removed. And they wanted the amendment to the Constitution that Marcos could still issue decrees, because now we already had the parliament that was happening. And of course, they wanted the change in the military defense treaty, that the aid that was being given to the Philippine government would not be in the form of rental for the bases, but it would be in accordance with how the Congress of the United States of America would want to give it. So marami yan na demands na ano, and that's exactly what Marcos told Habib, that you cannot tell me how to run my government better than I can. So Habib went back to the State Department, they had another meeting, and they said, we really have to get him out. And that was when, I quote exactly what Habib said during that meeting. Sabi niya doon, the end of Marcos, the end of Marcos is already done. So siya na nagsabi noon exactly that Marcos is already at the end of his term after the snap elections. He was the one who announced that. I do not have the direct quote, but you can read it in the book of George Schultz, and that was how it goes. But then I already mentioned how it was Stephen Sollarz who was announcing all of these anomalies against Marcos, especially since he was touching on U.S. aid. See, that is the budgetary consideration being given and passed by the U.S. Congress to the Philippines. That's every year or every quarter. And for him to announce in the U.S. Congress that Mas was stealing that money, that would really incense and get all of Congress to get mad at Marcos. And that's exactly what he did. He did that sometime in February, just prior to the snap elections. But the General Accounting Office of America itself did the review because, di ba pagka nagpe-privilege speech, the speaker announces that would be referred to the Committee on Justice or the Committee on Auditing, etc. Well, the speech of Sollarz was referred to the Committee on Auditing and Accounting, and the General Accounting Office of the United States of America did the review of everything that Sollarz announced during his privilege speech. And what did they find out? There was not a single cent at all. In the 20 years of the U.S. aid during the administration of President Marcos that had any anomalous color to it, or anything that was stolen, or anything that could even smell, or there was not even the scent of any indiscretion, or as Sollarz said, the stealing. And that report came out and was presented to Congress in May. Did media ever talk about it as a reply to the accusations of Sollarz? Wala, none. But we have a copy of that report because a copy was given to President Marcos. He was already in Hawaii. But none of the American media talked about it, or at least presented it in public to answer what their congressman said against Marcos. Wala, not even here in the Philippines, of course. Mrs. Aquino would not want that brought out. That is why we are revisiting, we are reviewing what happened then, and we are restoring the truth, which is the General Accounting Office that answered the accusations of Stephen Sollarz. May his soul rest in peace anyway. So that was how it goes during those days, and that is why I mentioned the eerie feeling that there is something in the numbers that plays with the fate of nations and the fate of people. Marcos was born on September 11. September is the 9th month. And Marcos was born on the 11th day of the 9th month, 9/11. How do they call now the bombing of the Twin Towers, which also happened on the 9th month, on the 11th day of the 9th month of the year? That's why they call it 9/11, on the birthday of Marcos itself. And that was where in New York, he was tried before the whole world of having stolen the money of the Filipino people and acquitted unanimously by an American jury. So the play of numbers, as I've said, somehow weaves through fate and the destiny of countries, nations, and people and individuals. August 21 was the bombing of Plaza Miranda. The opposition against Marcos had the rally. The rally was bombed. And for 14 years after that day, Marcos is being accused of having bombed Plaza Miranda. In 1986, when Mrs. Aquino took over, all of those who bombed Plaza Miranda surfaced, and they said, we were the ones who bombed Plaza Miranda because we wanted to blame Marcos. You had Lieutenant Victor Corpus at the time. You had several other of those communists who came out and said that we were the ones responsible. And of course, the final act that Mrs. Aquino did was to free Jose Maria Sison, who was responsible for the organization of the new People's Army and the National Democratic Front. And that was the first thing she did. She freed him together with several other commanders of the Communist Party of the Philippines. And then, during her term in 1992, her Senate adhered to the Military Defense Treaty amendment of Marcos that the bases would be terminated in 1992 unless otherwise extended. But the Senate under Mrs. Aquino decided to terminate the Mutual Defense Treaty for the bases. So they had to leave. But of course, nature took over. You had the eruption of Mount Pinatubo, and that's exactly what happened. They had to scamper away from those bases, Clark Air Base and Subic Naval Base. What an inglorious exit. And as I've said, this is what we are revisiting. That is what we are reviewing. And that is what we have to restore. Not just in memory, but for historical purposes. Because everything from 1986, when Marcos left the Philippines, everything else had its dramatic change in our lives, in our politics, in everything else that has happened at that time and continues to happen to this day. Well, thank goodness you have a President Duterte who is not of the mold of the past president and is able to bring back the belief of the Filipino people that it is possible to have a president who will adhere to the basic principle of giving a comfortable and a better life for the Filipinos. And that is exactly why you have the high rating of President Rodrigo Roa Duterte. And are you wondering why? Precisely because he is following again the building of a nation the way Marcos did it at that time. He's following several of what has already happened then, which is to plant, which is to give impetus to agriculture. And then, of course, the many statements that he has made regarding the Visiting Forces Agreement of America, the EDCA, the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement. Likewise, all of this is part of the foreign policy that was already initiated during the time of President Marcos. What happened in these 35 years? Ay nako, the sadness and everything that they tried to erase during this 35 years hence. So that is why we had to revisit, we had to review, and we had to restore. That is important. And I bring it back to you, as I've said, anybody can question, why am I talking like this? Well, I was there. I saw it up close and personal and professionally. Likewise, having covered the Marcoses for 20 years, having covered the trial in New York and several other of these foreign policy diplomatic missions, which actually brought us to that stage, which President Rodrigo Roa Duterte is now enunciating likewise with his foreign policy. So we look forward to the way Secretary Locsin of the DFA would now be meeting with his counterpart, Secretary Blinken of the State Department. But as I've said, remember, State Department in the United States of America is the one that handles the world in many ways. How is America going to be now for this administration of President Biden? We shall see. But as I've said, that was how the State Department behaved during the Marcos years and how it changed the life of our country and our people from 1986 onwards. Oh, we have several others here making comments. Rolly Reyes, the living Philippine history, especially during Apolacay, Marcos era, mabuhay po kayo, Madam Rita Gadi, bless. Freddy Oredina, present. Thanks for the review, Ma'am Rita. I remember I was following the event then from campaign period to post-election, and I was so devastated at the result of this propaganda behind it. And then several others, of course. I will be reading your messages after we close our program, and hopefully in the next issue next week, we shall be answering some of them. But meanwhile, again, we go back to the protocols we have to observe. I have to repeat this because we're still under the pandemic, but we are also under the pandemic of forgetting many things that we should take into consideration if we try to analyze what has happened to our lives. We have revisited, we have reviewed, and we have restored. And I think as far as you and I are concerned, this has been the product of our hour. Thank you very much for having joined me. This has been your hour, and I'm Rita Gadi.
Ba-ba-da-ba-dum,